What if that humiliated girl, who left home with swollen eyes from crying and a baby in her arms, came back years later, not to apologize, but to take control of everything? Not as a guest, not as a repentant daughter, but as an owner. Owner of the property, owner of the story, owner of herself. This is Rowena Hale's story, and it doesn't begin with applause or happy endings. It begins with a door slammed in her face and the kind of silence that only those who have been rejected by their own family know. That night, the rain was just a detail. What really hurt was the cold gaze of the parents. Charles, the father who always put reputation above affection, simply said he couldn't do anything. Margot, the mother who always demanded perfection, said that Rowena brought shame to the Hale name. No hug, no support, just judgment, only contempt. In minutes, she went from being a daughter to a burden, a nuisance, a shame to be erased. With a suitcase, an ultrasound, and a broken heart, Rowena crossed the mansion gate for the last time, without a destination, without a plan, but with something that no one could take away from her, the courage to survive. And even without knowing it, that moment planted a seed, a silent promise, that one day, she would return, and that she would return differently, with her head held high, with power in her hands, with her own name and surname. Years later, the scene is reversed. The same gate opens, but this time, it is not her father who commands her. It is her, Rowena Hale, entrepreneur, mother, independent. She steps onto the cold marble of the entrance, not as someone begging for acceptance, but as someone who sets the rules. And that house, which once rejected her, now belongs to her. What happened between the pain of that night and the power of this return is what really transforms this story. It is there that the strength of a discredited woman gains voice, body, and territory. And those who follow it until the end understand why some falls are just the beginning of the rise. Because what comes next is what none of them ever imagined. Stories like this don't just happen. They come when we need to remember that pain isn't a destination, it's a starting point. When we like this post, more people find the courage to start over. Each subscription is one more step towards keeping alive the stories the world tries to silence. This isn't just a narrative, it's a truth that lives on. And those who understand this help spread it. On that cloudy afternoon, with the sky hanging silently over the windows of the Hale house, Rowena sat in front of her parents as if begging for space, for listening, for acceptance. At 22, with sweaty hands and a racing heart, she announced in a low voice, she was pregnant. Elliot, the boy she believed she was loved by, had disappeared without a word after the news. He turned off his phone, disappeared from the networks, evaporated from her life as if he had never existed. And now, here, faced with the hard stares of Charles and Margot Hale, she still had hope of finding some support. But what he got was a sentence. You've destroyed everything. Get out of my house. It was Charles who said it, without raising his voice, cold, direct, like someone cutting a tie with surgical precision. Margot didn't even blink. She just stood up from her chair and pointed to the stairs, as if she were getting rid of a stain on an expensive fabric. In that moment, Rowena understood. She was no longer a daughter. She was no longer part of that family. She was a mistake to be swept away from the perfection they so defended. Minutes later, under a rain that seemed to punish more than wet, she crossed the garden with her eyes blurred, her body hunched over, and a small suitcase dragging on the gravel. In my hands, the ultrasound envelope, still poorly folded from the clinic. Inside, a black and white image of what would be his greatest responsibility, and his only solace. Not knowing where to go, he sat down on a park bench a few streets away. Water ran down her face, mixing with the tears she didn't try to hold back. I felt ashamed, abandoned, afraid. But more than that, I felt something even deeper, the beginning of a transformation that no one there would have been able to foresee. Rowena clutched the ultrasound to her chest and made a silent promise. I didn't know where I would sleep that night, or what I would eat the next day. But she swore that, from then on, no one would define her value anymore. No one would ever turn away a woman who just wanted to be heard. The humiliation of that moment was engraved in his memory with such force that even the smell of wet earth would become, years later, a reminder of where it all began. The image of the house being left behind, with its windows closed and lights on as if nothing had happened, was the symbol of the rupture. It was the end of a chapter. But what Rowena didn't know yet, and what few people imagine, is that this kind of pain, when it doesn't kill, shapes. And sometimes, it's in rejection that the seed of a great change is planted. This moment, although heartbreaking, is more common than many would like to admit. How many stories have begun with a door closing? How many people have been thrown into the world with nothing but their own dignity? What Rowena experienced that night is lived, in silence, by thousands who were left behind by those who were supposed to protect them. And telling stories like this is not just narrating a drama. It is illuminating a process. It is naming pain. It is transforming rejection into reflection, abandonment into alertness. That's why every comment here carries weight. Every line written below this video is more than an opinion, it's a testimony. Someone might see this story and identify with it. Someone might find strength where they thought there was only failure. And when the like button is pressed, it doesn't validate a video. It validates an experience. It says, this story matters. This pain resonates. Subscribing to the channel isn't just to receive new content. It's a silent vote for more stories that tell truths that no one has the courage to tell. Rowena didn't know what was coming. She only knew that she had to keep going. And every step she took on that dark path was fueled by a memory that one day, she would be on the other side. That one day, that soaked girl, with her suitcase in her hand and her world falling apart, would return to that same house, not as a rejected daughter, but as a grown woman. As someone who survived. As someone who won. And that's when everything starts to change. The morning after her expulsion, Rowena's body still shivered with cold, but it was another kind of pain that burned deeper, that of abandonment. The bench in the square where he slept was barely enough support. Her clothes were wet, her stomach was empty, and the ultrasound, already crumpled, was all she had in concrete terms at that moment. It was a black and white portrait of the only thing that made sense, Finn, still a promise, still a dream, but already her greatest reason. She spent the next few days wandering the streets with a lost look in her eyes, asking for some kind of work. She offered help where no one wanted it. She extended a hand that many ignored. Each no she received seemed like another confirmation that the world had no room for young, lonely, invisible mothers. She slept in train stations, shared bread with strangers, cried in secret so as not to scare others, as if her sadness needed to be contained even in abandonment. It was by chance that he found a sign on the facade of an old house, far from the center, room for rent, low price. He knocked on the door with dirty hands and shame in his eyes. The one who answered was Miss Dottie, a white-haired lady with a stern expression, but with a look that seemed to have seen enough pain to not be frightened by any other. She didn't ask about Rowena's past, didn't demand any guarantee. He just pointed to the small back room and said, "Help with the cleaning, and stay." That simple house became the first royal shelter since Rowena was expelled. Over time, Miss Dottie came to regard her with a kind of silent respect. I saw the way she took care of every corner, the way she rocked her son gently, the way she did a lot with almost nothing. Rowena cleaned houses, ironed clothes, washed floors with her hands until they cracked. She took Finn with her whenever she could, wrapped in a cloth tied to his body. She was judged, avoided, looked at with suspicion, but that never stopped her. On the hardest days, when despair threatened to swallow everything, she remembered the phrase that repeated itself like a mantra in her mind: one day, I'll own more than they ever dreamed. It wasn't about revenge. It was about courage. About proving to herself that she wouldn't be defined by that night of rejection. Every house she cleaned, every client who pretended not to see her, was fuel. Every humiliation was stored like kindling. And she knew, one day, it would all burn differently. For months, she lived at a pace that many would never endure. She worked all day, took care of Finn at night, and whenever the little one slept, she watched videos, read used books, and taught herself about organization, decoration, and aesthetics of spaces. She discovered that she had a natural sense for transforming spaces. She started with the bedroom where she lived, than the hallway of Miss Dottie's house. Soon, a neighbor asked for help reorganizing the living room, and without expecting anything in return, Rowena did it. The result was impressive. Recommendations came in. Compliments came in. Her first paying clients came in. She still didn't earn enough to make big changes, but for the first time, she felt that something was moving. That life wouldn't be all struggle. That there was room to build, to grow, to change the course of her own story. And Miss Dottie, that woman who was so closed off, began to show small kindnesses: a hot soup on a cold day, a guaranteed night's sleep with Finn in her arms, a word of encouragement that, said in the right way, was worth more than any material help. The years passed with a mixture of pain and achievement. Rowena didn't skip steps. She didn't take shortcuts. But she was honest. She was courageous. And each achievement was celebrated in silence: a satisfied client, a new recommendation, a small contract that paid the month's rent. She never forgot where she came from, and she never stopped carrying with her that scene of the rain, the suitcase, the ultrasound, the door closing. That was what kept her going. This part of the story is where many people get lost. Because this is where most people give up. This is where the pain is greater than the dream. But Rowena kept going. And so it is worth asking, how many Rowenas are today? At the darkest point of their own journey? How many people, silent, invisible, are doing the impossible to get it all done, even without support, without recognition, without rest? And those who have come this far know, this story has not yet shown its turning point. What comes next is where everything really starts to change. The New Year's Eve did not come with celebration or applause. It came like everything else in Rowena's life, silently, almost imperceptibly, like someone testing weather. It is safe to dream. It was another ordinary day, one of those days when the body seems to be asking for a truce, but necessity does not allow for a break. She had been hired by a demanding lady to do some heavy cleaning in an elegant house in the North Zone, the kind of job that no one wanted because it was too tiring and not very rewarding. But Rowena, as always, accepted. With Finn in her arms, tied to her chest with a sheet, she arrived early and left much later. What was supposed to be just a cleaning job turned into a spontaneous gesture of care. When she finished cleaning the master bedroom, she couldn't resist. He took the decorative objects from the shelf, repositioned some crooked pictures, and moved the furniture around to give the room more circulation. It wasn't what was agreed, but she felt she could improve it. It was instinct. It was to look. It was sensitivity. When the lady of the house went up at night and saw the result, she did not say anything immediately. He just stood there in silence for a few seconds, watching. Rowena felt her heart freeze, thinking she had crossed a line. But what came next was not rebuke. It was a sincere compliment. You have good taste. Better than a lot of decorators out there. That sentence opened something inside her. It wasn't just about tidying things up. It was about seeing possibilities, creating harmony, breathing new life into forgotten spaces. Impressed, Rowena asked for help reorganizing the rest of the house. Then she referred her sister, then a friend. Soon, Rowena was receiving calls from high society women asking for the girl who transforms a room with just a look. She still cleaned, still ironed, still washed floors, but she was starting to be called to do more than that. Each recommendation was received with gratitude and the same care she had shown from the beginning. Rowena never lost her sense of dedication. Every house she entered was treated as if it were her own. Even when she was tired, worried about the bills, and had no time for herself, she went above and beyond. And little by little, word of mouth turned into a network. She bought a better cell phone. She created a simple profile on social media to post before and after the spaces. She gained followers. Messages from other neighborhoods and cities began to appear. Nights that used to be spent in silent despair became nights of study. Rowena threw herself into tutorials, technical videos, and free courses. She learned about colors, lighting, ergonomics, aesthetics, plants, and style. She began studying until the early hours of the morning, with Finn sleeping by her side. The little money she managed to save was invested in used books, recyclable materials, and basic tools. She began to assemble her own kits and stopped depending on customers' tools. As the months went by, the requests for services increased. People called wanting to transform entire rooms, entire houses. She began to charge more, embarrassed. At first, until she realized that the value of her work was not a favor, it was competence. She created a visual identity, a simple name for what was now a business, Casa Serena. And everything that came in was divided into 3 parts: survival, reinvestment, and a small savings account that grew, penny by penny, with a single goal: to guarantee a future for Finn that did not depend on the kindness of others. She still lived at Miss Dottie's house, and now she treated her with a mixture of admiration and quiet affection. There was never an open exchange of affection, but there was something there, a solidified respect. Miss Dottie didn't say much, but she began leaving envelopes with small gifts, books on entrepreneurship, clippings from interior design magazines. It was her way of saying, "I believe in you." Rowena remained focused. There was no room for distraction. Each step was taken cautiously, with awareness. She knew that success was fragile, and that one stumble was enough for everything to fall apart. But she was not afraid. She was clear. She knew what she wanted. And more, she knew what she would never accept again. She was not looking for luxury. She was looking for freedom. She was looking for autonomy. She was looking for the right to not depend, the right to choose, and, above all, to never again have to leave through the back door, ashamed of existing. These changes are not made by luck. They are made by solitary decisions, by small courage, by small choices that no one sees. Rowena still felt the weight of rejection, she still carried the scars, but she no longer walked hunched over. She was standing up. And those who followed closely could see, this woman was building something much bigger than money. She was building a name, a purpose, a history. And for those who watched this part, the comment below is more than an opinion. It is a sign of presence. That this fight touched her. Comment, "Every house needs roots." Because that's how real stories keep resonating. And what comes next is still just the beginning of the great transformation. Years passed, but the memory of that night never left Rowena. The door slamming shut, the muffled sound of rain, the weight of the suitcase in one hand and the ultrasound in the other. For a long time, that was the last record of the mansion where he grew up. And even though she had built a new life, made a name for herself and raised her own son with dignity, she never forgot the gate that expelled her. So when the email arrived, almost like a whisper of fate, the world stopped for a second. Hale property to be auctioned in 30 days. That sentence seemed like fiction, but it was real. The house where she had been rejected, humiliated, hurt, was now for sale. Rowena didn't hesitate. She took a deep breath, closed her laptop, and picked up her phone. Not on impulse, but out of conscience. That cycle needed to be ended, not with anger, but with presence. With firmness. With truth. She called her legal team and asked that the acquisition be made through a holding company linked to Casa Serena. No need to expose her name, no need to fuel speculation. What she wanted wasn't a trophy. It was an elegant end. The day of the auction arrived without fanfare. And when the final bid was made, when the gavel fell and the house was officially transferred to the new owner, no one there understood what had just happened. The girl who once walked out the back door now had the keys to that place. And with them, the opportunity to rewrite everything. Without announcement, without press, without pomp, Rowena returned to the mansion. She said nothing to Finn. She simply led him by the hand to the gate that had once seen her leave. The same gate that now opened with a different sound. A sound of new beginnings. The garden was dry, the windows dusty. The great front door, once imposing, seemed smaller before the woman who now walked through it. The house seemed to have stopped in time, as if waiting for the return of something that had been lost. Each room still bore traces of Margot, of her cold perfectionism, of the furniture that never matched affection. The walls seemed to whisper memories, some filled with pain, others from a more distant past, where there was still innocence. Rowena walked slowly, as if respecting the sacred ground of her own memories. The upstairs hallway, the bedroom where she had spent her childhood, the staircase where she had sat crying as she Listened to her parents argue about what to do with her. Every corner was a fragment of who she had been, but now, seen through the eyes of who she had become. Finn ran around the rooms, enchanted by the size of the place. He asked questions, imagined himself living there. And even though Rowena hadn't answered out loud, something inside her already knew this house wouldn't just be an asset. It would be the new heart of the legacy she was building. A space that would carry her name with dignity, that would tell a story of pain, but also of overcoming. And that, renovated, would be the materialization of everything she had learned throughout her life, that strength comes from the ground that they tried to deny. That value doesn't lie in inheritance, but in reconstruction. She walked back to the entrance and stood there for a few seconds. The afternoon sun beat down on the weathered facade, revealing cracks in the plaster, leaves stuck in the gutters, and an old beauty waiting to be rescued. She saw more than a house in ruins. She saw potential. She knew exactly where the transformation would begin. She knew which walls to tear down, which memories to keep, which symbols to preserve. She knew this would not be a simple renovation. It would be a healing. And in that moment, with her hands on the banister of the old staircase, she no longer felt anger. She did not feel hurt. She felt clarity. The past did not need to be denied. It needed to be embraced and overcome. Because she was no longer trapped by it. She was above it. In every corner of that house, there now lived the certainty that she was not defeated. And that, for the first time, everything was under her command. The sound of footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, now creaking more frequently than before. The house, despite being imposing, bore the weariness of the years and the abandonment of the loved ones who once pretended to live there. Rowena walked slowly, observing every detail of the mansion that had been a home without ever being a welcome. The main staircase was still intact, but the handrail required care. Faded linen curtains swayed in the wind from a half-open window. It was as if time had stopped waiting for that moment. The moment when she, and only she, would return with the power to rewrite her own history. She spent her days overseeing the renovation, guiding teams, personally deciding on every color, every material, every texture. Nothing there was casual. Every choice carried intention. No gold, cold marble, or rigid lines. The Hale's new home would have soul, warmth, and truth. And perhaps that's why the universe chose that moment to once again bring the past to their doorstep. On a gray morning, a black car pulled up in front of the property. Charles and Margot Hale got out of the back seat. Rowena watched them from the second-floor window. She stopped. She took a breath. She didn't feel anger. She felt something sharper. Distance. They were different. Older. Charles, more hunched over, with a lost look in his eyes. Margot, still upright, but without the brightness of before. There was something desperate in the way they looked at the facade. Like someone trying to recognize a place that no longer belonged to them. When the doorbell rang, she took a few extra seconds to answer. Not out of hesitation, but out of conscience. She was the one who dictated the time now. Upon opening the door, there was no immediate recognition. Charles, his eyes, downcast, only looked up after an uncomfortable silence. Margot analyzed the environment with the same clinical gaze as always. And then, her eyes met Rowena's. 1 second was enough. The stiffness on the mother's face eased. The air disappeared from the lungs. It was impossible to deny. It was her, the daughter they kicked out, that they erased from albums, from dinners, from conversations. She was there, before them, standing, solid, whole. Owner of the home where she was once denied. The silence fell like a sentence. Neither of them knew what to say. Charles tried to make a gesture. Margot opened her mouth halfway, as if searching for words that simply did not exist. Rowena, with a fixed and serene gaze, waited for the discomfort to pass. Only then did she speak, in a low but firm voice, pronouncing each syllable as if finishing an ancient truth. I walked out with nothing. Now I return with everything, but not for you. The sentence hung in the air like a weight impossible to ignore. No answer came. Only silence. Charles cleared his throat, embarrassed. He tried to justify it with at the time, it was difficult, but the words sounded empty. Margot, with tears in her eyes for the first time, took a step back. Rowena didn't accuse, didn't shout, didn't retaliate in kind. Because it wasn't about them. It was about her. About the woman who had rebuilt herself without any of the hands that had once pushed her out the door. Charles and Margot asked to come in. Rowena hesitated for a second, then gave in. She knew what she was doing. She knew she needed to look at it all head-on, for the last time. They walked through the hall with a mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. They recognized the spaces, but they no longer belonged to them. The house had changed, and more than that, their daughter had changed. Rowena observed each reaction with an impressive calm. Because for someone who has experienced rejection in their own name, nothing scares them more. They sat on the sofa she had recently chosen, an organic, comfortable model, far from the rigidity that Margot so valued. The contrast spoke for itself. They tried to talk about the past, remember small details from their childhood, justify decisions. Rowena just listened. And as much as their gestures were attempts at reconnection, she knew, and they knew too, that the abyss between who they were and who she had become was impossible to cross without scars. Margot spoke of longing. Charles spoke of regret. And for an instant, Rowena saw in them a fragility she never imagined finding. But he didn't give in, because the pain they caused had no simple cure. It was a pain that demanded presence, truth, time. And in that room, she was no longer the daughter who begged for love. She was the woman who, despite having no ground, built an emotional empire where before there was only absence. The conversation continued between pauses, shy confessions, and a thick silence. Every word exchanged there was more for them than for her. Rowena understood this, and so, she allowed it, not out of weakness, but because she had complete control over what was happening. They were there to rescue a version of their daughter that no longer existed. And they would need, little by little, to deal with the fact that the new woman before them no longer owed anything to anyone. In that room where for years she had been just a contained presence, an inconvenient noise within the Hale family's impeccable silence, Rowena now commanded time. The conversation with Charles and Margot stretched like a thin thread of memories, each sentence carrying more the weight of the past than the lightness of any attempt at reconciliation. And she listened. Without rushing, without explicit judgment, but also without rushing to forget. Because forgetting would be to erase the path, and the path is what transformed her. She was no longer a young woman in search of acceptance. She was the woman who understood that dignity is not asked for, it is built. Charles spoke with difficulty, trying to shape his regret into words that would fit into this conversation. Margot kept her face up, but her eyes betrayed a weariness that came more from conscience than from age. They wanted some form of return, a nod that there was still room to be something in Rowena's life. But what she had become no longer fit the mold the two of them were still trying to sustain. Rowena knew there was something noble in forgiving, but she also knew that forgiveness was not synonymous with coexistence. And there is no repair without responsibility. When she stood up and crossed the room again, she looked at every corner of the house that now bore her identity. The soft colors, the light wood, the organic fabrics, the lines that invited coexistence. Everything there was new. No oppressive memory resisted the renewal. And yet, everything preserved the essence of what she believed in, transformation with purpose. No pretending. The past did not exist, but no living trapped in it. With a calm voice, Rowena broke the silence. She said she didn't hold a grudge, because grudges are a prison, and she had learned to live in freedom. She said she recognized their attempt, but that their paths had taken different paths. She didn't wish them harm or revenge, but she also couldn't pretend that everything was okay. Because it wasn't. And it wouldn't be. And at that point, all three of them knew it. Charles lowered his head. Margot, for the first time, wept silently. And Rowena, without hardening her face, remained standing, firm, centered, unbeatable. There was something in her posture that no amount of humiliation could erase, the certainty of her own worth. And that was enough. Hours later, with the house empty, she allowed herself to walk alone through the now redecorated spaces. The garden, which had previously been a symbol of distance and order, was now an open field, with benches in the shade and flowers dancing in the wind. And there, running through the plants, was Finn, the son who grew up watching his mother build everything with her own hands. The boy who learned that strength is not shouting, it is constancy. Who saw firsthand what it's like to start over without playing the victim. Rowena watched from afar, her eyes shining not with tears but with awareness. The house was alive now. It carried voices, footsteps, laughter. The cold had dissipated. And when she closed her eyes for a moment, she heard not the past but the now. The soft breathing of the present, where she was everything they had said she would never be. In the main room, on one of the restored walls, a simple frame held the phrase she herself had written in a moment of profound clarity: "They gave me exile. I turned it into empire." That wasn't just a statement. It was a reminder. For her, for Finn, for everyone who entered there. That no expulsion is greater than the will to remain. That every rejection can be a starting point. And that the most solid empires are not built on inheritance. They stand up with courage. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light filtered through the refinished stained glass windows, creating soft patterns on the walls. And Rowena, now in the center of the room, felt something that for years had been impossible to access: peace. Not the peace of someone who has forgotten what they have experienced, but the peace of someone who knows exactly what they lived through, and yet chose to remain standing. This story does not end with easy reconciliations, nor with forced hugs. It ends with the truth, with the dignity of someone who suffered, but refused to sink. With the presence of someone who was expelled, but returned as owner. With the certainty that some turns are stronger than any beginning. And Rowena, the woman who had left home with a suitcase and an ultrasound, was now planting the seeds of a future that no one else would have the right to prune. Anyone who has felt the story in their skin, chest, or soul knows some twists and turns are more powerful than any starting point. To continue receiving narratives that heal, inspire, and transform, subscribing to the channel is the next step. And if you have made it this far, leave a comment below. She came back as an empire. Because that's how pain becomes a legacy. Some stories don't end, they open doors to even deeper ones. Those who have come this far already know what it's like to feel goosebumps from truths that touch you deeply. And what comes next is even more intense, with revelations and decisions that change everything. The next story is already being prepared, and those who follow it closely feel every twist as if they were part of it.